to our fourth and final edition of 2023 of the Be Your HR Best webinar series. I'm Declan Leonard. I'm managing partner here at Berenzweig Leonard, and I also head up our firm's employment law practice.
I'm Drew Smith. I'm a senior associate here at Berenzweig Leonard. I also am part of the employment law team as well as the litigation team.
And we're coming to you here today live, actually. Live is always a little bit trickier. I had to go pick my daughter up from school because she was sick, so I scrambled back here, but I got back on camera on time. We're coming here from BLC Digital Strategies. So we've got this great studio here in Tysons, run by Todd Castleberry, who's president of BLC Digital Strategies. And the great thing is it's right here in Tysons, right near our offices. So I literally can grab the coat on the back of my door and run into the studio. I didn't get as much makeup this time as normal. How about you? It looks like you sat in the chair for a while.
I did. I had to.
Yeah. All right, Drew. It's the end of the year. So we thought, here's what we're going to talk about. Performance evaluations. Okay. Most companies tend to do these at the end of the calendar year. We're going to talk about that today and talk about why that, perhaps may need to be tweaked quite a bit. But anyways, we thought optimizing annual performance review process.
Yeah, absolutely. And it seems like the performance review process has kind of devolved a bit. It used to be what it says. It was for performance evaluation. Now it seems that it's just basically tied to bonuses or to increases in salary or in title, and that's not always the best way to kind of perform these performance evaluations.
No, I mean, for lack of a better phrase, the performance evaluation process for many companies is really a broken process. There have been polls out that say that it is demotivating. It is often inaccurate in terms of the information that's put in there. So while companies really do mean well, listen, we're employment lawyers. We see these evaluations many times in the context of giving legal advice related to a performance-related issue. Companies mean well, but I think what we're going to focus on today is it's really not working very well in terms of how they're doing it.
Yeah, and it does. It takes a lot of work on the front end, and especially by management, and it takes a lot of work from businesses to kind of put in a process and a system that really does work. And I know that you deal with EEOC complaints just like I do, and when we ask for performance reviews or evaluations of individuals, we see a very wide array of how businesses perform these performance evaluations.
I typically, maybe this is a bit dramatic, but I tend to hold my breath when I say, hey, can you send over, company says, hey, look, we've got this issue. We've got to take care of this HR problem. We've got this personnel issue. And I'll say, okay, you're telling me a lot of stuff. Can you send over the most recent performance evaluations? I want to see them. I want to see that backed up in the documents. What do we usually see?
Well, it's a couple of different things. Sometimes you see, and there are companies out there that do a great job, and they really do, they paper things correctly, especially for the legal side of it, to see where there's deficiencies or reasons why somebody would be terminated. Other times you have companies that sometimes have indecipherable matrix that they, it's focused not necessarily on measurables, but focused on kind of feels or how somebody might, act, or it's things that you can't really put your finger on, or it's these numbers. Hey, they're a 1 here, they're a 3 here. Well, what do these things really mean?
Yeah, we'll talk about those. And we're certainly not going to be talking about these in the context of all bad. In other words, we think that these performance evaluations are most effective when they reward employees, when they let employees know, here's what you're doing right. Here are some things you need to work on, but here are things that you're doing right. So this is by no means, lawyers need documentation to back up some kind of a termination. That's not going to be the focus of our discussion today. We really think that it actually can serve as a motivating factor in the workplace. The one thing you just touched on before we dive in is the advent of HR software. Many of our clients do use these platforms. Talk about some of the benefits, but also perhaps some of the detractions of using these softwares.
Sure. Well, one of the things that you really want to focus on when you're talking about performance evaluations is consistency. And I think that for the most part, HR software, you're going to have a very kind of consistent, if it's rankings or if it's measurables or just even the format of it, you're going to typically find that. But as you and I have spoken about before, these require a bit of a personal touch, and it can't just be. We talk about the innovation of AI and how is this going to end up being something that, businesses end up using AI to perform performance evaluations, but it really does. It requires consistency, but you need a personal touch, and really it is the frequency as well. I think a lot of businesses view this as an end of the year type of thing, but really this should be kind of a continued throughout the year. You're emphasizing the things that your employees are doing well. You're rewarding them, but you're making the corrections throughout the year, not just one time.
Yeah, the human touch is really an important thing, and I think it gets lost. I do think there's many advantages of HR software. Companies that are big, it's just really just too hard to maintain this stuff in traditional, sort of paper format. What I love, paper format. But you're right, the human touch, and that's usually between the manager and the employee. And there's a phrase: people join companies, but they leave managers. It's one of those things where, if you have a bad manager, that human touch, it doesn't matter what platform you have. You can spend so much money on your HR platform, but if you've got a bad manager who is not motivating people through this process, it's not going to work out, and it's not going to create a solid relationship for the employee.
Right. And I mean, you got to remember, let's go back to the reason why you do performance evaluations, right? I mean, my feeling on this, and hopefully you somewhat agree with this, but it's first of all, let's really reinforce the things that the employee is doing well. So let's point out the things that they're doing well and continue to reinforce those and to continue to develop. The second is, let's point out things where there could be improvement, and not pointing it out in a way that makes the employee defensive, but pointing it out in a way to collectively come together and say, well, how can we improve this? Here's the problem. Now let's come up with a solution.
Yep, absolutely. So let's dive in. We've got a number of people joining live today. We will, of course, record this and then send this back out. But we do want, as always, questions. We also feel free to send in, comments in terms of, what's worked and what hasn't worked, because every workplace is different. Every workplace has its own dynamics, its own environment. And so we're not here today preaching a one size fits all. We're really just talking about, here's what we see of issues related to performance evaluations that need to be improved. Okay, so let's start off talking about just the format of evaluations. What's sort of the first thing that you would look for in conducting in the format of conducting a performance evaluation?
So this is kind of like building a brick wall. If you don't have a good base and a good foundation, what's going to happen? Your wall is going to be crooked. It's going to fall down. So it really does start with the organization itself, really establishing what are going to be the baselines. How are we going to conduct our performance evaluations? When are we going to do it? It's about setting those kind of parameters and then filtering that down to the managers and explaining to them, hey, here's what we need, here's what we're looking for, and understanding that everyone's kind of responsible in this whole process. One of the big things is to not overcomplicate this. When you actually get to the performance evaluation itself, again, we've both seen it. This complicated matrix of, well, here's, we're going to mark you 1 to 5 here. It's going to be 1 to 3 here. We're going to do this. And that might be okay for a huge organization where you're not taking a lot of time for performance evaluations, but really it should be targeted for the employee, their job title, and don't make it too complicated.
Yeah. So you talked about the having a solid foundation, and I think a lot of companies sometimes look at the performance evaluation and say, oh, well, that's going to be done in November or December, towards the end of the calendar year. But really what you're saying is look back to the beginning of the year and create that foundation. Have a solid meeting of the mind with the employee, between the employee and manager, about what am I going to be evaluated on this year? What are the core competencies? What are the things that I need to work on, so that it's not some mysterious process where you're like, oh my gosh, at the end of the year, what am I being evaluated on? So I think starting with that is pretty critical.
Yeah, and I mean, even including, within an employee handbook, some understanding of what are you evaluating? When is this going to take place? Consistency is huge, but you can't really have that if it's overly complex.
Yeah, you've talked about the number system, and again, this is no knock on one company's evaluation system or one HR sort of platform, but the 1 to 5, and I know a lot of companies use it, and I'm not saying abandon ship right now, but I'm just saying that does create a lot of confusion for a lot of people. So you have 5, let's just say 5 being the best, exemplary. Depending on who's doing the review, they may say, nobody's perfect. I don't give those. So in essence, they've now changed it so that 4 is really a 5.
Right.
So if you give away 4, so it creates a lot of inconsistency, and then the employee's like saying, well, okay, does that mean I wasn't that good? And then you have other managers where there's call it grade inflation, where everyone's getting 4s, and so it really creates a little bit of confusion.
That's why if you can, tying the benchmarks to something fact-based, not something that is more of a, well, I kind of feel this way or I feel this way, or leaving it up to the discretion of the manager. It's, did you achieve this? So, did you meet X amount of sales during this time? Did you have this number of billable hours in terms of, for a law firm? Being able to do that, it takes away, some of the discretionary matters that maybe could get a company in trouble as well.
Yeah.
If you're looking at this from we're not getting too much into the legal standpoint, but looking at it from a legal standpoint, it's easier to be able to justify, a termination or even a promotion over somebody else. When you're evaluating, 2 potential employees for advancement, and you select one over another, it's easier to be able to tie that back to something that's fact-based and say, well, this person was measurably better in this matrix.
Yeah, so for instance, if a category is leadership, did this person show leadership? And it doesn't have to be an executive or even in management ranks. Did the person show leadership? It should not be like a 1 to 5 on leadership. I mean, you can have that in there, but you really need to have like a place where you can show specific, just as you're saying, specific examples. You're not trying to write some long essay about this particular employee and their leadership, but just say, took initiative to implement X within company or something like that, just something that showed initiative and leadership, and then that at least can justify whatever numbers so that there's not that confusion caused by it.
Yeah, and I mean, if your goal through the performance evaluation process is to make your team better, make your company better, then of course what you want to do is you want to have those types of specifics, and you don't want to tell somebody, hey, listen, you need to be better in leadership, because what does that mean?
Yeah.
But if you can say, hey, listen, in meetings, we need to see more of this. We need to see you to take initiative and to lead this team or to lead, this group. This is what we need. It makes it easier, and it ultimately, you are solving the problem that you're kind of bringing in here with this performance evaluation, which is increasing productivity or whatever it is in your organization, but helping to grow those employees.
Yeah, I mean, performance evaluations, you said this at the very beginning, they need to be forward-looking. You look to the past for examples of good and perhaps areas of improvement, but they really do need to be forward-looking. They need to say, okay, you did this, we'd love to see more of it. There's actually, I read one company does, it does 3, instead of doing the numbering system, they do 3 things. They say that, like, for each category, business development, leadership, they either say do more, do less, or continue just as you are, and right. So it's interesting. I mean, you kind of pare it down to just very basic stuff. And for that particular company, it seems to work very well.
Yeah, and it is. It's not a one-size-fits-all type of thing. You need to kind of feel it out for your organization, and sometimes it will be a size thing. Maybe your organization has hundreds of employees and you can't, get into kind of the nitty-gritty for each one, and something like that sounds perfect. Where it is a very easy evaluation, but it is not kind of, what's the difference between a 3 and a 4?
Yeah.
And, it's
and who's giving it out? Yeah.
And who's giving it out?
There's another thing, and maybe on the flip side, maybe something not very productive is what's called stack ranking. And basically, what stack ranking does is it strives for the company to have a bell curve. GE back in the day, probably, used to be infamous for this. And so what you end up doing, though, is you end up finding problems with certain people to get them on the bad side of the bell curve, just to make sure that that's properly formulated and that you have the right distribution of employees. That's not what an performance evaluation should be about.
Well, remember, I mean, I think that at least the rumor was that's what they do in law school, right? Is that you have the bell curve, and so a certain number of people have to get D's
Way
or
to
have
bring
to
that
get
up.
B's.
I'm still scarred from that.
I know, but
I did my duty in law school. Somebody's got to be. No, just kidding.
But what did it do? It made everybody more competitive, right? And there's not, in an organization, you want some semblance of competitiveness, but you also want teamwork. And so when you're pitting each other against, who's going to be on the right side of that bell curve, I think that's probably why I personally have not seen any, organizations doing kind of that stacking ranking.
So let's talk, we're continuing to talk about sort of the format of these evaluations. How about the concept of devoting time? I've heard this concept that some employees feel lawyers sort of shortchanged. They call them drive-by reviews. Just kind of like, come on in, come on out. Like, here's the paperwork. Let us know if you have any questions. What do you think? I mean, look, there's finite amount of time people have to produce, and the company's got to do it, but what's your thoughts on how much time to spend with an employee during the review?
Well, again, it's not going to be one size fits all, but you have to be putting in the time. If you're going to commit to this and you're going to have these performance reviews, you're going to be expending a good amount of time. So why not do it the right way? And if it means taking a little bit more time to be able to actually see some market difference, some change, some growth in an employee, I think that's what you have to do. And it's again, it's not, we shouldn't be looking at this as a one-time, of the year type of thing. The consistency of it, but the frequency as well. It really should be that these year-end, or if you're doing it semi-annually, you're reinforcing the things that you're talking about throughout the year. And yes, that does take time, and yes, that takes time from your HR or your management or whoever is having to take the time to prepare. But ultimately, that's what you're doing this for. You're doing it for the growth.
So also the setting, so you're talking about how much time to devote to it, and then the setting of it. Where does it occur? Like, these things actually make a big difference. I know here at the firm, when we weren't quite as big, Seth Berenzweig and I, when we were the two managing partners, we would largely take people to lunch.
Yeah.
And it sounded great. It was like, oh, this is great. But like over time, we realized that setting, we should still take people to lunch, but that should be for a different purpose, because there's all kinds of distractions when you're having lunch.
Right.
Sometimes it's hard to have a real candid feedback. You're right in the middle of talking about like a really, really compelling issue that you want to really improve, and then they say would you like a refill of your iced tea or whatever. So I personally don't think like a lunch type setting. I think or a dinner. Maybe happy hour in some cases, but who knows? But no, I think it should be probably in a business-like setting.
Yeah, I'm actually laughing because I do remember early on when I was here, and we did, and you and I went to a local restaurant, and there was like a birthday party or something that was going on, and I remember like having something very poignant that I wanted to talk with you about, and hearing "Happy Birthday" next, and it's you're right. Like there's, especially during lunchtime, there's the clinking of the glasses, and there's people talking, and the waiter, the waitress are coming up, they're refilling, you're starting to eat, and then there's that awkward, do I eat now? Do we have something important to talk about? So yeah, I mean, I do think that for the most part, it's more of a professional setting, and similar to what we do here. You sit down and you have a nice area to be able to sit and to chat that's comfortable. It puts people also a little bit at ease, because when you go out to lunch, there is a certain level of kind of decorum and all. Just I don't know. I feel like I'm gonna drop half the stuff on my shirt when I'm out. So I want to be just comfortable in a good environment. It's an environment that everyone's used to. How about that? Now, was there anything specific that happened that made you all realize, you and Seth realize, hey, we shouldn't be doing this at lunch anymore, and maybe we should do this in the office?
Yeah, I gained 25 pounds at the end of the year. No, it was largely that we felt that the reviews were not substantive enough. Mm-hmm. Like, you know what I mean? They were more like, yeah, this was a great year, or hey, it was a good year, what can we do better? But it was like, I never felt like it was truly what a performance valuation should be, which is substantively, let's discuss how we continue with the good stuff and maybe try to improve some of the stuff that needs improvement.
Yep, and I do remember that it was a little bit more of like, hey, here are all the good things that are going on, because you just kind of feel like you have a limited time, and you're in kind of that environment where it's a little bit more jovial, and I understand that, and kind of seeing the difference, it does give me some perspective.
Yeah, and okay, so when you see one of these performance evaluations, there's obviously things to fill in. Sometimes we see, inadvertently, I believe, most of the time, companies will put in some phraseology or something that, could come back to bite them.
And I would like to think that it's something that is not done consciously, but thinking when we were kind of talking about this, one of the things that had come to my mind about inadvertently putting something in a performance evaluation, we were representing a company in an age discrimination case, and one of the things that was produced was the performance evaluations, and you could kind of see, and this gentleman had been with this company for a number of years and had gotten up there in age. And you could see, though, that, kind of early on, there was, not really much discussion about kind of the urgency of his work. And then you saw, as, in recent years, there were comments about, well, it seems like, you've slowed down a little bit, you're not getting as much done as you. And that can signal, some type of age discrimination claim right there. And so when you start to put those things, even if you don't really, you have no discriminatory intent.
No, people inadvertently, I mean, you walk into this stuff, you put your foot in your mouth plenty of times, but that's why they need to really look at what they're writing, and potentially, and I think we'll talk about this when we talk about who should participate, that it really should be not just one manager on an island doing these reviews. I mean, it really should be a lot more collaborative, so that other eyes are looking at this, so that somebody can catch this type stuff. But yeah, you got to be very sensitive about stereotypes, inadvertent, let's hope, but nonetheless, if they show up on the paper, they can be used against the company, and we've seen it happen. Yeah,
and we've seen, one of the other pitfalls is kind of dinging people for personality things. So maybe, maybe they don't get along with somebody, and so it's, we think you are, you're too opinionated, or you've been. There are these little kind of trigger words, trigger phrases, which can, if used in a different substance, it could be looked at as perhaps discriminatory. And so again, that goes back to what we were talking about before, which is, let's tie these to some type of measurable matrix. Let's not put this in your manager's hands and force them to kind of, flesh out, these many areas where they have to fill in all these things for these performance evaluations. Have something that you can actually measure, instead of having something that's more of a, well, I think this. Yeah. I think you're doing this.
Or if you have specific examples, because I do think one of the key pieces of measurement in these performance reviews, in addition to your regular performance, your output, like what you're doing, whether it's billable hours or whatever, I do think, acting professional and acting civil in the workplace is just critical for cohesion. And so, but if you're going to go in there and use words that are more stereotypical, you're being aggressive in your demeanor and blah, 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 you should be able to give specific examples, without creating a laundry list, but just say, hey, look, you probably could have handled that interaction with, your colleague a little bit differently. So those are things you definitely want to include. And then
and I was just going to point out something as well. And if you are going to do that, and you're going to have these, and you're going to point these things out, make sure it's consistent across all employees. So if you're going to point it out for one person, because what you don't want a situation where, and again, I know we're not going to get too deep into the legal side of things, but where there's from the EEOC, and there's there's been this allegation. They're going to ask for can you give us other performance evaluations of people that are on that team? And if the only performance evaluation that deals with somebody's personality is person A, who's brought the EEOC charge, and nobody else's is discussed, that's going to look questionable.
Disparate treatment, they'll latch onto that very quickly. And then at the end of most reviews, there is a space for, I think they usually call it like a rebuttal by the employee, fill this in or whatever. So how would you respond? We get this question a lot. How do you respond to an employee rebuttal?
That's a great question, because, and again, that goes back to what we're talking about with having a process which is a bit more uniform. There's consistency. Because if you're doing this one time a year, and you're going in, and it's where, you are telling the person, well, here's all the things that you've done wrong. What is the natural response? It's to be defensive.
Defensive, yeah.
And I think you've pointed this out before, and it's great. In the legal world, what we're doing is if you get a motion, you're drafting an opposition, and that's what sometimes these rebuttals look like. Is they go through and they tell the employee, hey, here's all the things that you haven't done correctly, but you're given the opportunity to be able to explain yourself, and they turn this into a 2-page opposition where it's, well, here are all the things why this happened, and here I wasn't given all of the information that I needed. I wasn't given the tools. I wasn't given the people. I wasn't able to do this because of this. I was sick. I had this. You're gonna have just a laundry list. That's right.
It becomes more of a tit for tat, as opposed to maybe the better way to do it is, because the employee should have the ability to, I don't like the word rebuttal. I mean, it's almost like formalistic, like you've said this and I'm going to say something totally different. This is my rebuttal, the sky's blue, no, it's black, type thing. And it's like, okay, well, we have to work together, past the date of this review. So maybe a better way to do it is, have the review. Don't just, hand somebody a review that's in writing that they have to then digest. Have that as more of a companion to a conversation.
Yes.
And then don't ask necessarily. And then I would schedule a follow-up. I would say, listen, I want you to have a chance to process this. I want you to have a chance to think about it. We are not doing this because we think the relationship is ending. We're hoping to do this because we want it to continue and improve going forward. Please take this information in that vein. Can we get back together for coffee, in 2 more days once you've had a chance, and then we can talk about it. And if you feel after that conversation that you want to memorialize stuff, that's fine. But I think there's a cooling off period, so I think that would work well.
Yeah, and you were talking earlier about that Gallup poll where I think it's something like 14% of all employees think that these types of performance evaluations are useful in any way.
Yeah.
But in terms of allowing for a rebuttal, it needs to be something that's collaborative, and it needs to be something where the employee and the employer are coming together and there might be some issues. So let's say, the easiest thing is to talk about, sales, and you say, okay, well, you're supposed to sell 100 widgets per month and you're averaging 75 per month. You've now put together something where it's measurable.
It's data. It's hard to argue with it.
Absolutely. Yeah. You're saying, hey, here's our expectations for it. And then instead of just saying, well, why aren't you meeting the goals? And that might be where you get that laundry list of, well, here's everything that's going on in my life and here's why I can't do it and this isn't fair.
Yeah.
And sometimes that opens up things. If you have, perhaps there's an ADA claim that they accidentally put in one of these rebuttals, and then, you're stuck in terms of being a business.
You got to do an investigation
it leads to a whole slew of things. But instead of that, if you say, hey, listen, we need to get you up 25 more widgets per month. What can we do to help? And what can you do? And so to turn that into something that's more collaborative, and then memorializing that within the body. So now the employee feels like they've been heard. They feel like they've had an opportunity to be able to be part of the solution as well. And again, if the whole goal of this is to improve performance and to grow your business and to grow your employees, it starts with it comes to that. That's where everything kind of changes, is where you have them and you're collaborating with them to be able to figure out how can we do that? How can we increase your productivity in this case?
Yeah. So the next topic to go into is frequency and sort of the frequency of this feedback. And it's a controversial, or it's not a controversial, it's a head scratching process, because you'd love, of course, to be able to do these way more frequent than once a year. Once a year, it does seem like if that's the time that you're getting together, just once a year, that might not be enough. But then again, it could be enough depending on the culture of your company.
Well, and I think about, as attorneys, being licensed in Virginia, we're required to perform certain hours of continuing legal education. So we have these CLEs. And the deadline every year is October 31st. So it comes once a year. And what ends up happening is everyone's scrambling in the month of October. They're not doing it in January and February and March. It happens because here's the deadline for it. And I think it becomes kind of the same thing when you talk about these performance evaluations, is that, when businesses make them annual and they put them at the end of the year, nobody thinks about them until, I've got this, in a couple of weeks, and then they're scrambling just to kind of put everything together. And again, it's not as productive as how it should be. So in terms of the frequency, it's having managers who are managing.
Yeah.
It's having people within the organization where there's accountability and being able to address both good and bad. You see an employee that's struggling somewhere, don't wait till the end of the year to address this with them. I know, with myself personally, there's been times before where I've had things that you all have come to me and said, hey, listen, can we change this? Yeah. Oh, I didn't realize I was doing that. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Let's not wait till the end of the year to talk about it.
It really, saving it up to the end of the year does nobody any good. We've got a couple of questions, some of it touching on stuff that we've already talked about. What is your recommendation about providing the review to the employee prior to the meeting to discuss? So, in other words, you've got the written one, and providing it prior. What do you think about that?
That's a good question, because I can see pros and cons to both ways. One of them is you're giving them the opportunity to kind of do exactly what we were saying, to format that opposition, and to go through and say, well, here are all the reasons why I have done what's expected of me, and how this is not a reflection of who I am or what I do. On the flip side of it, you make a more productive conversation because they know exactly what's going to be discussed. You kind of reduce the anxiety that sometimes accompanies these types of performance reviews. So, I think that if you have a culture in your organization where there is frequent communication and there is, a good, rapport that you have with managers and employees, and everyone's talking and they're communicative, I don't see a problem in providing that before, so that you can use it as exactly what it's supposed to be doing, which is, let's enhance the growth here.
So my thought is this. The actual verbal discussion of a review, I think, can be handled in a much warmer, empathetic way than what shows up on a piece of paper. And especially the way we see the format of these pieces of paper, where, half the time I have to decipher, okay, is this the employee's feedback? Is this the manager's feedback?
Yes.
What was the topic? And it can come off very cold. And I think I personally, and again, this is why it's a good discussion. People out there may disagree also, but I think it sets kind of maybe a less empathetic tone going into it, and here's why I think it also does do what I'm advocating by not giving that. I don't think you're also springing anything on anybody either, because if you're giving consistent feedback throughout the whole process, throughout the whole year, then this should not be a surprise anyways. If there are things in that review that you're worried about this being the first time they're hearing it, well, then you probably have failed as a manager, in my opinion, because you should have brought this stuff up in some way or another, so that when you're talking at a review, you're able to point to stuff and say, we talked about this, and actually you've gotten better about it in the last couple of months, or we talked about X, Y, and Z. That's why I don't think maybe doing that. That'd just be my personal opinion.
Yeah, I think about, I've got a toddler at home, and when she's running amok, and even yesterday she was taking these electric candles, which, they have the batteries and make them flick, and she just decided she was going to take them and spike them like a football, and she's just throwing them. I can't imagine waiting until the end of quarter one to address these things with her. And again, not to make light of
Christmas morning. You're a little light on presents this year, darling. But that's because of, remember 2 months ago when you were throwing candles?
Right, and sometimes I think you kind of make that analogy, but you do, it's okay, it's in the moment, we know this is going on,
it's gotta be real time.
Let's talk about it. But vice versa, if your employees are doing something well, they should also be recognized for that as well. These performance evaluations should not just be everything that is wrong and nothing that is right, because you talk about teachable moments. Here's a great teachable moment, but let's reinforce the fact that there are things that are being done correctly.
Yes, you have a great arm, honey, but just don't throw that. Throw a ball instead.
That's right.
Here's another question, and I see this a lot in the literature. Do you recommend separating reviews from compensation discussions, increases, whatever? What do you think on that?
Yeah, see, that seems to be more of the trend now, because I think that these annual reviews, and again, as a business owner, maybe you could kind of opine on that, but everyone was kind of lumping everything together because it's just the easiest way to do it. It's the end of the year. Hey, we're making our determinations about, who's going to get a raise, who's going to get a promotion, bonuses, whatever it might be. And oh, we also have these annual reviews. Let's just do everything at once. And so I think everybody kind of, they tie these things together. But I don't think that that's always the best way of doing it. Why? Because, now that piece of paper that's in front of you, that performance evaluation, that becomes, are we going to go on vacation this year? It becomes
Like a
more
cause and
dire.
effect thing.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
so you become more defensive as an employee about things. And you want to, instead of using it as, again, what it should be, which is to enhance productivity, enhance the employee. You're just saying, okay, well, here's this, everything that we do in this annual review, this piece of paper is what is going to determine what you're going to be paid, if you're going to be promoted.
Yeah.
And I think that it becomes, it's a much more dire scenario.
I understand. I mean, I definitely understand that because I can see a situation. And again, I have been a managing partner here for the last 13 years. So this is good because obviously you're on the other end of things, and so I can understand that very much. I understand maybe why. We typically have done those. We typically have combined them. We usually get together twice a year,
Right.
One mid-year and one at the end of the year. But I can kind of hear from your perspective what you're saying, which is as you're going through the review, in your mind, you're distracted by calculating, okay, how is this going to impact that last part of the discussion,
Right.
which is, and so do you get distracted? Is it a true open discussion, or are you really just kind of like tabulating in your head, how many dings did I get and how's that going to impact the number? And that's not really the point. By the same token, I just know also there's just finite time. And
Sure.
so, we've been fortunate that in most respects, we've been able to tie those to, kind of happy discussions at the end and things like that. So, in that respect, it's actually a good cause and effect because, if you have a good positive review and then at the end of it, you reveal, a nice size raise or something like that, it's kind of happy all around.
Yeah, and I think if you're if you have good communication, if you're talking to your employees, if you're correcting behavior, if you are, doing all the things we were talking about in terms of the frequency, I don't think that it becomes as, do or die type of situation at the end of the year for that annual review. You should understand everything that's going on and what's going to be going into that annual review, and you should really have an idea if you're going to be getting promoted or you're in a position. If you're frequently being spoken to at work and saying, hey, you need to improve this, or this is, that you're just not getting this, you're not doing this, you should know at the end of the year, well, probably not going to get promoted, or maybe, I'm not going to get much of an increase, if at all, in my salary.
Yeah.
I think that that's probably a better way if you're going to tie those things together. Just make sure you have that frequency with feedback.
I think companies need to kind of reconsider what is a review. A review, or giving somebody performance feedback, is not always just that sit down that we keep talking about here. You go into a nice conference room and you sit
Right.
down and you talk it through and you go through the 1 to 5 and all that stuff. I mean, as you've noted all throughout this discussion, it should be continuous, it should be frequent, and it is an area where companies, and again, companies, don't have limitless resources, and sometimes you do try to smooth things over for the sake of just kind of making things smooth in the office place.
Right.
I'm a big advocate of the email. I'm a big advocate of emailing something to an employee from a manager just saying, hey, as we just talked about, we really need this to improve. And it could be 2 lines, 3 lines. But what I would want to be able to see at the end of the year, or if there's a termination decision, is this employee surprised? Was this brought to this employee's attention? Mm-hmm. It does not have to be a long diatribe. In fact, I think that is off-putting if it is. But like, hey, I'm hoping this will get better. As we just discussed, we really need to see more professionalism in your demeanor in the workplace. I really, your interactions with such and such really just do not meet our expectations. I'm confident that this will improve going forward. Something positive, but also, just in black and white in an email.
Yeah, and you're right. Like businesses don't have unlimited resources to be able to, I guess, ideally do everything that we're talking about. But if you can make some of these changes, and really, I think one of the most, the 2 most important ones are frequency and consistency. Uh-huh. And if you can start to, really foster a internal work culture where there is communication and where there is, input throughout the year, it's going to make things easier from the performance evaluation. Instead of scrambling at the end of the year for the performance evaluation and trying to pull all this stuff together and everything, you're going to find out that as you kind of become more attuned to these, these types of more frequent feedback, you're not going to spend as much time on the end of the year because everything's already going to be done for you. So it's going to end up being...
it actually lightens your load, makes it an easier process as opposed to, God, what happened in
this year?
Q1?
Right.
Like, I don't even remember. I mean, things, people, I don't know what I had for lunch yesterday. So, people forget this stuff very quickly. All right, let's hit the next topic. And again, we appreciate these questions coming in. If people are looking at why I'm looking down, it's because I'm seeing questions come in.
We have a very technologically advanced process for getting these questions in.
Okay. So who should be involved in these reviews? That's always a tough question. It seems to vary from company to company as to how they do it. And sometimes, again, it has to... You have a reality of, like, there's only so much time. HR only has so much bandwidth to be involved in every single thing. So what do we see out there, and what do we think is a more ideal situation? Yeah,
again, it's not, every organization, it's not one size fits all. And sometimes, a business might have, an HR department that does have the bandwidth to be able to do this. Other times it might be an immediate manager for a certain, area of that business. But what it should be is consistent, and it should be someone who is consistently, they're grading the same group of people, so that there is not, what you don't want is, you don't want to have a business where it's the HR is evaluating person 1, 2, 3, and then you have a manager who's doing 4, 5, 6, then you have a vice president who's doing 6, 7, 8. Because like you said before, you're going to have people that their evaluation criteria is different. There's not going to be kind of a consistency, and that's when you might get in trouble from a legal standpoint, where somebody says, well, I was dinged much harder on my performance reviews than this other person, and that's, might show disparate treatment. So I think that in terms of the consistency, you need to identify somebody who has the bandwidth, who has the time to do these correctly. But even more so than that is that you need to have somebody else who can perform an audit of how these performance evaluations are going.
Yeah.
Because it's great if you have somebody out there who's doing this and they are being consistent, but you need to have the checks and balances and somebody else to come in to say, hey, listen, these are being done correctly, or hey, we need to do better here. We need more of this, more of that.
Yeah, I saw one company, and they actually did it almost like a group, almost like an admissions process in, like, college, where, you have so much sort of subjectivity of, like, is this person letting these people in or whatever. And so they did it a little bit more of a group discussion. They basically would pass them around. And again, this is not feasible in a lot of workplaces because of the number of employees. Or maybe it is. Maybe you form little teams or whatever. But the more eyes that can do it, the more that can catch potentially what we talked about before, some stereotypes that can creep into the language. But it also just creates more, if you see a particularly bad comment, somebody could challenge that and say, okay, so wow, you really came down hard in this review on this particular employee. Give me some examples of, like, what it is, and you can really kind of listen. And if that person's listening and saying, yeah, okay, but what you're telling me here doesn't really match what's showing up in black and white on this piece of paper. Right. Maybe tone it down a little bit. We all could use that. I mean, that's why here at the office, when we're drafting stuff, we always, like, sort of team up, have somebody else, at least one other person, read stuff, because tone is something that sometimes I'm always toning down briefs, and people don't like that, so.
Yeah, and I've noticed with myself before, even though I don't mean to, sometimes emails come off as, like, aggressive with just however it is.
That's inevitable. Yeah, people. Right. Yeah, email, like, people. Yeah, people read into it, even if you don't intend it at all. People read into it.
But that's why you need somebody who is kind of overlooking and to say, hey, listen, we should tone this down. We're not at that point yet.
Yeah.
And so it's important for in terms of having some type of audit as well, so that that it's not just checking the box and okay, performance evaluations are done, great, we're done with that. As an organization, make sure you're looking through and making sure it's reflecting what you want to show. And one of the other things, and again, turning a little bit to the legal side, is also don't be afraid to explain to an employee and to put in the performance evaluations if they're not doing something.
Don't sugarcoat.
Don't sugarcoat.
We see it all the time. And
Yes.
that's a problem because reviews are done during the holiday season when,
right.
first off, people are rushed and they're so busy and they're over their heads. But they're also generally in kind of a potentially a better mood, and
Right.
they're like a more giving mood. And they're like, I can overlook this. And that's where that number system, that 3, that mediocre goes to a 4 very quickly just because, hey, we're all going into the holidays and we're going to see them at the holiday party too,
And I know you've seen this before. I know we've worked on cases before where you ask the client, you say, okay, you're telling me this employee was terrible and that they just, they've been here for 3 years and they just couldn't get anything right. And great, send us over your performance evaluations. And then you see, and it's like, why do they have 5 out of 5s across the board? And why is everything? And you're right. I think some of it does have to do with the holiday season. Some of it has to do with, hey, our mentality is somebody's sitting right across from you.
Yeah.
You want to tell them, hey, here are all the things. You want to show, you want to point out the things that they're doing well, but at the same time, if there is a problem and there's a persistent problem, you can point that out, but cite to specific instances or cite to something that is related to fact, that it's a matrix. So you can say, hey, listen, you're doing your best here, but in terms of your sales are 50% lower than the next lowest person on the team.
Yeah.
And then come up with solutions there. But there's nothing worse, and I'm assuming you've seen several of these, but when you have a client that just says, oh, they were terrible. We fired them because of performance. Performance was awful. Really? Well, they have very glowing performance evaluations.
They got a raise. Right. Then they'll say, well, that was cost of living, and it's like, okay, we're going to have to explain that one away.
Right.
Let's talk about, on the topic of who should be involved in the whole review process, this concept of 360-degree reviews.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's, so for those who don't know what 360 reviews are, it's kind of what it sounds like. It's everybody around you is giving some input into your performance. And so that means that as like a senior associate here, I would have associates who I work with who are providing input, might have some of the admins, might have managing partners. Everybody is kind of
around you,
is putting in, and while I think that
it's a big trend. I don't know to what extent it's cooled off. I know in the last 10 years it's been, and maybe the last 5 years it's been a very hot trend in HR. But there are definitely some pros which you're going to talk about, and there's also some cons. Yeah,
it's great for someone who's kind of like I am, kind of in the middle there, because you do have a lot of different points of view. For somebody, maybe it's an associate here, you might not get as robust feedback because there's nobody, kind of below you on that in terms. So it's more of a 180 review, I suppose. But it is, an incredible amount of time, because if everybody's providing in their own feedback for each of their colleagues, it's going to take time. You also probably find, and I guess to an extent we do that a little bit here with evaluating from kind of a couple of different. I think we kind of select a couple of different people. It's not
do provide input,
right. It's not everybody. From my own perspective, I think you get much more kind of credible. You get much more robust reviews of what you're doing because you're seeing it from all around.
Yeah, like an example would be, let's just say one of the things that we value in a senior associate like you is mentorship. How are you mentoring the other associates?
Right.
Okay, and we would then have to sort of evaluate that. If we weren't doing a 360-degree review, we'd have to evaluate that based on what we're seeing. Is there something formalized, whatever. If we got feedback from people saying, you know what, I see Drew in the kitchen, we're making coffee and stuff, and inevitably that turns into a 10-minute conversation about the case that I'm working on, and Drew will give me, and I know that this happens in real life here, and Drew will give me pointers on doing a position statement and how, what's the best approach, and maybe some arguments we didn't think of, like the same actor defense and things of those things. We might not have seen that happen because it's not some formal mentorship program, but getting that input from somebody that you work with, a colleague, and even somebody more junior to you, to me, it's more about it's invaluable, and I think so we do solicit all of that throughout here.
Yeah, and I think that that's helpful. I mean, at least from receiving that type of feedback, it's helpful as well because we also have a culture here where it is kind of a mentorship, and to be able to kind of take on and to from a senior associate to work with the associates, and it's very collaborative here, and so I think that makes it more useful because you are seeing it from all around, as opposed to maybe an organization where you don't have it's more of here's the here are the workers, here's management, and that's it. You might not get, because there probably is not a culture where there are measurables like how you have mentorship here, where that's going to be valuable to you.
Yeah.
But
And so many of our clients, especially in the government contractor realm, the employees are not on site. You have your back office headquarter employees, and then you have your other employees, whether they're just remote generally or whether they're on site at, let's just say, a government agency or something. It's hard. That's why getting additional people to provide feedback is critical, because how do you know what they're doing on a day-to-day basis? How do you know how they interact? How do you know truly when their deliverables are largely going to the end customer? How do you know? So I think companies really need to think about, where are we getting feedback from? Are we getting it from the most relevant stakeholders here?
So from looking at this as a managing partner here and owner of a business, is that 360 review, do you get more out of that in being able to evaluate employees than what you do from kind of the traditional, approach for performance evaluations? I
mean, so if you look at the way we used to do them, yes, 100%, because we're growing as a firm. It used to be a little bit easier to kind of have your ear to the ground and know what was going on in terms of people. But now that we solicit deeper, I think we get better feedback, and it's and it's great. I mean, so much of it is just positive that we're able to then convey in that meeting, whereas before it was our own observation. Drew, remember we worked together on that one case, back in February. That was a great experience. But you're working on tons of stuff that I'm not touching on, because we've grown as a firm. So yeah, it's a much better process. The fact, do we formalize it as a 360 review process? No, but we take the main component, which is let's get broader feedback than we normally would.
And again, to foster a culture in an organization where you have employees, when they're asked for feedback, to give candid feedback, and I think we do kind of it anonymously here. So that is also part of it, is to encourage, don't just mail it in. Like when you're asked for feedback from a colleague, if you're going to do the 360, make sure that it's emphasized to the other employees. Hey, listen, here is what we would like from you. Here is what we don't want you to just say, hey, Jim's a nice guy, and I wave to him when he walks by my office. It's like, well, let's get, even if it's not great feedback, let's get that out there, because it becomes more of you have an understanding of what's going on at all levels of your organization.
And I think if you sit in a review and you see, wow, they're telling me all this feedback that they clearly don't know themselves, so they got this from other people, and this is, and a lot of it is very positive. I really appreciate that they did that, because that made my review so much better in the eyes of everybody. It probably means they're going to be more invested in the process and provide more input too. We do have a question. Somebody wrote in and asked about remote workforce and engagement of remote workforce. That is we've actually done quite a few podcasts on that topic. That's we probably can't get too deep into that, but there is an offshoot of that, which is in a remote workforce. Here's a question. Should you require employees to come to headquarters for the review, to do it in person? And of course, they may be local, they'd have to drive in, but if they're fully remote, that would be a deviation from their schedule. Or, they could be out of state, and the company, of course, would have to foot the bill for them to come in. What do you think about that for reviews, to do those in person for remote employees?
Yeah, it's funny. You think back 4 years ago, and this would have been just a crazy question. But now it's wow, this is it's relevant, and it has, depending on what you're doing, I mean, I feel like the culture of the organization could kind of dictate how things are communicated. So if you are dealing with an employee 100% over Zoom or 100% virtually, I think that's how you should convey, the appraisal. That's how you should provide feedback. That's how, continuing in that, it seems a little disengaged to say, well, we're gonna have you remote. You're going to be working remote, but we're going to make you come in to sit down in person for just this. But I mean, what are your feelings on that?
Yeah, no, it's an interesting one. You and I talked about this actually a little bit before coming in here, and at first I thought, that's a really nice token. That's a really nice gesture to do. But then when we were talking about it, you pointed out something good that really resonated with me along the lines of what you just said, which is, well, then does that mean all of our other discussions up until now were not quite as good as being in person? Like, when we had the meeting 2 months ago about getting that really big contract that I ended up winning for the company, and we did that by Zoom. Was that not as important as like us doing this? So I could see flying them in for a celebratory dinner, maybe it's a group dinner or whatever. I think that would be a really nice gesture.
Right.
But I think and not only that, but it creates unnecessary angst because a lot of terminations are done in person, and it's like people fly out to there, and you're like, oh, I didn't expect to see you there, and you see the writing on the wall. So I agree with you. After thinking about it and after listening to what you had to say, I think if it was good enough for all of the business that you've done throughout the year, it should be good enough for the review. And again, it may vary from place to place, but that's my thought too. Let me just see real quick.
Yeah, and it's funny you bring up that the angst and it doesn't matter in terms of like a performance review when you kind of put so much of your eggs in that one basket, and again we're talking about kind of the organizations that maybe just do this one time annually. It does, no matter what it is, even from the business, even if you have you've been given great feedback and everything, there is some anxiety as you're walking in there, like, oh my gosh, maybe I've just completely misinterpreted this situation, which again goes back to the frequency of this and making sure that your employees are not surprised with what is included within these performance evaluations. But yeah, I could definitely see somebody who maybe is working on the West Coast and they are remote 100% of the time, and the business goes, hey, listen, we need you to come fly to DC to talk about this performance evaluation.
Yeah.
You're probably going to have some questions.
Somebody had a really good question about a topic we talked about earlier about whether or not you should combine the review with like the compensation determination.
Right.
And it was, okay, does that mean then that a company is not able to say that increases are performance-based if they don't give increases at performance review time? I think that's a good point. I mean, we do combine the two. Mm-hmm. And so we do combine the two, and I do think, in many ways showing that cause and effect is very important. I think what you impressed upon me is that, maybe from the employee standpoint, it can be a little bit distracting. I still think that it's hard to divorce the two, because you don't want it, because then when would you do it? Would you have it a week later or 2 weeks later and leave somebody in limbo and then say, well, but that doesn't seem like much of an increase. Why am I getting a lower increase? Well, don't you remember 2 weeks ago we had your review? Yeah. I said that I saw a lot of stuff in literature talking about this. Right. I do understand from the employee's perspective that it is a little bit preoccupied and distracting during the review. We still do it this way, which is combining the two, and I can't imagine that we would do it another way. So I think the question is a good point in that it sends a confusing signal as to, are they tied together or are they not tied together? And people are motivated by money. Yeah. So, at the end of the day, you do want people to improve performance, if nothing else, maybe their own career satisfaction, but if nothing else, because of money.
Yeah, I guess divorcing more of the two conversations. So the one conversation is exactly what we've been saying with the performance review. What are you trying to do? The goals are to emphasize and to reinforce the things that the employee is doing well, and to point out the things that you want to see improvement. And doing all the things that we said with setting, having the goals and the matrix and everything else, but having that in terms of the compensation or the position change, whatever it might be, those two things should kind of be addressed separately in terms of what they're trying to accomplish. So if you're using that to reinforce the good behavior, and you're saying, or the good production, and say, hey, listen, because of this, and you've been doing so well here, we're going to increase your salary. That's great, but that still should not take away from if there needs to be improvement there. And I think sometimes it's probably easy to say, oh, well, I got a raise, I must be doing everything okay. But to have the two things separate in that sense, I understand if you're going to be doing it at the same time, and it is hard to probably separate them completely. Yeah. But in terms of the frequency as well, if you have an employee who's doing fantastic and is doing great, I mean, you might not wait till the end of the year to increase their salary.
So we were worried coming in here that we wouldn't have enough to fill an hour. Well, guess what? We have filled an hour. We still have to do everything.
Oh my gosh.
We're such employment law geeks. You know, only we could say like time flies when you're having fun. But so we didn't get to everything, but that's okay. We got
Sounds
to
like a part 2 is coming up.
Yeah, that's right. I'm going to drag you in here again. But anyways, first off, and I think it was also because we did get so many questions, we got so much good feedback on the topic. But yeah, I think we're going to be cut off at 2 o'clock anyways, which is right now. So anyways, great discussion. Thanks everybody for joining us. We're going to continue these Be Your HR Best webinar series. If you have a topic that we haven't covered this year, or even if you want it covered again, I mean, this stuff changes from year to year. Please let us know. You can write us in. Hopefully you have our information from the invite that you signed up for with. Please let us know if there's any topics or anything, but we are going to continue these on a quarterly basis in 2004 and hopefully beyond. And
2024.
Jesus, 2024 and beyond. Thank you very much. So anyways, thanks again for joining us, and good discussion, Drew. Thank you.
Thanks, Declan.